Okay, so get ready to dive into the fascinating world of Tatiana von Leis. She's
Yeah.
a contemporary artist, and she's really sort of asking these huge questions about the future of humanity.
Yeah, and I think what's so great is we have such a, we're lucky to have a bunch of different sources for this deep dive. We have exhibition reviews, we have artist statements, even some critical analyses.
Right, it's great.
Really get a sense of, her work.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because she really blends art and science and philosophy all together to create this really thought-provoking experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that's so captivating about her work is
Mm.
how she really kind of pulls back the curtain on a future where those lines, they're not just blurred, it's like they've been totally redefined.
Yeah, it's
You
true.
know?
So who is she? She's a contemporary artist. I mentioned that. The reviews say she's originally from Austria, now based in Germany.
Mhm.
And get this, she actually started out studying philosophy
Oh, wow.
before jumping into the art world.
That makes total sense when you start to look at her work, because you can really see that philosophical background informing all these questions she's going into, these really complex existential questions.
Mm.
And it's not just about aesthetics with her. It's about grappling with what it means to be human in this age
Yeah.
of, just such rapid technological advancement.
It's really true. And even where her work is shown, I mean, we're talking like the Max Planck Institute for Biochemistry in Munich. I mean, this is
Yeah.
not your typical art gallery.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, her connections exhibit at Max Planck is a great example.
Yeah.
You walk in and it's dedicated to scientific inquiry. It's about unraveling the mysteries of life at a molecular level.
Right.
And then you have von Leis' art on display,
Yeah.
which often incorporates that same imagery, and it's like it forces a conversation.
Right, like these two worlds that are usually separate. She's saying, no, they're really intertwined. This is so interesting. Another exhibit that I thought was really fascinating was this exhibit, Transhumane Verstrickung. And it was held at the Städtische Galerie Theodor von Hermann in Imst, Austria.
Okay?
And even the title of that, I think, is very telling.
Yeah.
Transhuman entanglement. What is that? So I'm very interested to get into this exhibit.
Yeah, and what's so interesting about this particular exhibit is it really focuses on her reinterpretation of Ingrid's portraits. Those iconic images of like high society women from the 19th century.
Right, right.
Like Ingres was a master of capturing this very idealized form of beauty.
Mm-hmm.
And von Leis kind of uses his work as a springboard to explore like what happens to those ideals in the face of all this new technology, all this transhumanism,
Right.
this idea that we can transcend the limitations of our human bodies through technology,
Right.
which is, kind of a scary thought.
Okay, so we've got these exhibits, and they're in these really interesting locations. Like, what do we see when we're looking at her work? What's her style?
We'll get ready for a visual feast with a little side of cognitive dissonance,
Okay.
because her work, it's anything but simple to kind of digest.
Oh.
One of the reviews I read said it was like classical portraiture crashes into molecular biology.
Wow.
And I think that's a pretty accurate way to describe what you see.
So, like, how does that play out on the canvas?
Like imagine you have this very traditional portrait, like a woman in a gown.
Right.
She's posed against a dark background, kind of like something you'd see in a history book.
Yeah.
But then she disrupts all of that with these incredibly intricate details that are drawn from the microscopic world. So you have cells, you have DNA strands, almost like she's revealing these building blocks of life that are hidden beneath the surface.
Oh, that's so interesting. And she actually uses a scientist named Francisco J. Anguita as an inspiration.
Yes.
So, what's the connection there?
Well, his work focuses on microbiology.
Okay.
And I think you can see his influence in the precision and the almost scientific accuracy of her details.
Right.
Like she's not just bridging the gap between art and science in the themes, but also in her very technique.
Yeah, it's really interesting. But then there's this discomfort of beauty that I think you see in her work. And I think a lot of the critics have pointed this out. It's one thing to juxtapose these two different styles, but there's something kind of unsettling about the final product.
Right. And I think a lot of that has to do with how she tackles the human form.
Okay.
So think about classical portraits. They're very often trying to capture this idealized form of beauty, right?
Right.
But in her work, she takes those features like the eyes, the mouth, and often they're obscured, they're distorted. It's like she's peeling back the layers of that idealized beauty and kind of revealing something a little bit eerie, a little uncanny underneath.
It's interesting because it's like what we see today with all this digital retouching and stuff, and she's doing the opposite,
Yeah, she's highlighting those imperfections.
which we usually try to erase.
Absolutely. And, in the context of transhumanism, it takes on this whole other meaning. Because, like, if we start using technology to enhance ourselves or alter our physical selves, what happens to our definition of beauty?
That's a good question.
Does it become, sterile, artificial, even a little eerie?
I know some people have even compared her work to Francis Bacon a little bit.
It's an interesting comparison. Yeah. I mean,
And for those who don't know his work, it can be, kind of grotesque,
yeah,
unsettling.
for sure. But I think it's a fair comparison because both artists seem really interested in exploring the darker aspects of the human condition
Right.
and how those might be kind of amplified as we push the boundaries of what's considered human.
I think it's so interesting. Now, there was this Rothschild portrait I wanted to ask you about. This one seemed to be getting a lot of attention.
Oh, yeah.
And I think it was a great example of how she takes something familiar and really kind of turns it on its head.
It really is. So you have Ingres's original portrait of Betty de Rothschild. It was painted in 1848. And it's considered a masterpiece. It's like the epitome of wealth and elegance.
Okay.
She's draped in these luxurious fabrics. Every little detail is perfectly rendered, meticulously rendered. But then von Leist gets a hold of it and
What does she do?
imagine those classical features that Ingres captured with such detail. They're blurred, they're fragmented, the opulence is still there, so you still have these fabrics in the jewelry.
Right.
But now it's juxtaposed with this sense of unease, almost like a haunting emptiness. As if something essential is missing or has been altered in a way we can't quite place.
I love that. And so it's like, behind that facade of wealth and beauty, what is the true cost of this pursuit of perfection, especially when we have the technology to manipulate all of that?
Exactly. And I think by using this historical portrait, she's highlighting how our understanding of beauty and of humanity itself has evolved over time, and how those changes might even speed up as we enter this, new era of post-human possibilities.
It's so interesting. I mean, it makes you wonder, what will our portraits look like
Right.
in the future when some artist like von Leist is reinterpreting them?
Absolutely. What will they choose to highlight or distort or to question about us?
Right.
It's a fascinating thing to consider. It's like she's holding a mirror to our present moment, but with a few key details strategically blurred
Wow.
to force us to confront those possibilities that are lurking just beneath the surface.
Okay, so we've talked about how she uses her art to make us feel this like tension between beauty and technology, but like, what's the why? What is she saying about posthumanism?
It's interesting because she doesn't shy away from these big questions, these philosophical questions. Like, she actually refers to her work as post-human art.
Wow, which is a big statement.
It is.
But I think we need a little refresher. We keep saying transhumanism, posthumanism. What do those actually mean?
You're right, it's easy to get lost in all the jargon. So think of transhumanism as basically taking what we are now, like our abilities and our lifespans, and enhancing them through technology.
Okay.
So using like genetic engineering to eliminate diseases or implants to boost our brain function.
So it's like humanity, but with a software update.
Exactly.
Yep.
Posthumanism goes even further. So that imagines a future where those enhancements are so profound that we're no longer human as we know it. We're something else.
Okay, so where does she fit into all of this?
It's interesting because she's grappling with the implications of both.
Wow.
It's not just about, oh, this technology is cool. It's also about the ethical dilemmas.
Yeah, like what kind of dilemmas? Give me an example.
Okay, so let's take life extension,
Yeah.
which is a big one for a lot of transhumanists. And, on the surface, living longer sounds great, right?
Yeah,
But what happens if only a select few get to do that?
that's true.
What happens to the rest of society? Do you end up with this even bigger gap between the haves and the have-nots?
It's like a sci-fi movie. The wealthy people live forever and everyone else is struggling.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not even just about wealth. It's about what happens to our understanding of life and death, our values. If we can tinker with death like that,
That's true.
it really makes you question, our place in the world.
Yeah.
And those are the kinds of questions that her work makes us confront.
And she does it with, the molecular imagery we see in the portraits, the distorted faces. It all kind of seems like a metaphor for those bigger questions.
Exactly. And it's so interesting how she ties in. She pulls in the ideas of someone like Jacques Monod, who was this molecular biologist who actually argued that there were these like ethical principles.
There's ethical principles in molecules.
I know. But like even in molecules, like even single-celled organisms have systems of growth and adaptation and cooperation.
Right.
So he believed that by studying these self-organizing principles in nature, that we could create a more ethical framework for humanity.
Wow.
Like a framework that's grounded in, the fundamental interconnectedness of life.
So it's not about us putting our own morality on technology, but it's about looking at nature.
Exactly. And that goes back to what she talks about, which is bridge thinking. So she's not just an artist, but she's a thinker, and she's constantly making all of these connections between art, science, philosophy, ethics, and showing us that they're all part of the same conversation.
And it feels like a really important conversation to be having right now with everything that's happening with AI, with technology, with biotechnology. It feels like a turning point.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And she's not just asking us to think about this in some kind of abstract way. She wants us to take responsibility for the choices that we make today.
Because it's going to inform the future, right? To
Yeah.
think big, like she says.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think what's so powerful about how she does this is that she does it through art,
Right.
which is so great because it kind of bypasses our brains a little bit and just goes straight for our emotions and our deepest fears, our
Our
hopes.
anxieties, yeah.
Yes.
And it makes you wonder, like, when people look back at our art, what are they going to think?
Like, are they going to see our anxieties, or are they going to see, the fact that we're at least thinking about these things
Yeah.
and that we're aware?
It's so interesting.
It's a really fascinating discussion. So anyone listening, if this is your first deep dive into the work of Tatjana von Leis, I urge you to check it out. It's challenging. It's thought-provoking. It might make you a little uncomfortable, but it will definitely stay with you.
Absolutely. She's definitely a force in the art world, and I think her work will continue to resonate for, years to come.
Yeah, I think so too.
Ah,
Well, this was a fascinating deep dive. Thanks for joining me.
thanks for having me.